Ludwig von Mises was an Austrian economist who spent his life swimming against the tide. He faced war, opposition from his peers, and persecution from the Nazis for one reason only. He knew what it means to have a free society and why it's so important. Time after time, Mises stood up to the dominant ideologies of his day, and today, he's recognized as a giant in economics who inspired Nobel Prize winners, revolutionized economics, and inspired academics for years to come. This is the incredible story of his life and the ideas that changed the way we think about freedom. The late 1800s were the height of the age of empire in Europe, a time when monarchies, the state, and strict social hierarchies were seen as the natural order of things. Ludwig von Mises was destined to break that mold. Ludwig was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1881. Galicia, where he grew up, was a relatively impoverished area with an agrarian economy, but when Ludwig was around 8, his father landed an engineering job in Vienna, which gave him access to a higher echelon of education. By the age of 12, Ludwig was fluent in German, Polish, and French. He could also read Latin and he understood Ukrainian. But the subjects that most fascinated him were economics and history. Ludwig read voraciously, and he particularly enjoyed stories about the German Kaisers, although even at that young age, he could easily see through the bias of the history books he was given. Right from that early age, and all through his life, Ludwig retained a suspicion of the power of the state to do good. Not that the state wanted to do wrong, but it was incapable of doing good. Over and over, he would be proven right. In the year 1900, Ludwig began studying for a PhD in economics at the University of Vienna. At the time, the dominant theory was the German Historical School of Economics, which argued that economics was to be understood through analyzing history, not through logic or mathematics. But in his third year at university, Ludwig was introduced to the works of Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School of Economics. Menger's key insight was that the price of any good or service was not the cost of production, but rather whatever the buyer and seller agreed the value of the item was. You might have learned that the price of a good or service is the cost of production plus a markup. Let's say the total cost of a cup of coffee, the beans, the milk, the sugar, the cup it's served in, the labor involved in producing it, is $1.50. The coffee shop adds a markup of $2.50 and the price of the coffee is $4. But just think about that for a moment. Can you imagine someone objecting to that price on the basis that they could make their own cup of coffee for much less? Probably. But under some circumstances, might someone else be prepared to pay much more than $4 for a coffee? In a free society, both of these scenarios are possible. This was Ludwig's first key realization. The only way to accurately determine the right price for anything, be it a cup of coffee or something like steel, wheat, or wages, is to allow customers and producers to compete freely and determine the value of goods and services through their prices. It's hard to overstate how radical this idea was in the empire-dominated world of early 20th century Europe. At the time, the government was responsible for determining the price of things, but the more Ludwig thought about it, the more he saw that this could have devastating consequences. In 1912, Ludwig published his first book, The Theory of Money and Credit. In it, he argued that money had naturally grown out of the ancient system of barter, and it is not the invention of the state. For millennia, one farmer could exchange his surplus of apples for one of his neighbor's chickens, let's say 20 apples for one chicken. However, if this same transaction happened in a different place, with different people, you might very well end up with a completely different exchange rate. This is because the question of how many apples one chicken is worth depends entirely on how the people involved in that specific transaction value their apples and their chickens. Because of this, naturally, only the people involved in a transaction can determine the exchange rates. This subjective valuing of goods had worked with cattle, seashells, salt, silver, and early printed currencies for centuries without interruption. Ludwig argued it would continue working in modern economies, if only governments and central banks did not interfere. As soon as any external authority introduced more money into an economy, it would always be distributed unevenly and raise prices, because it weakens the very thing people use to measure value: money. And because of this, inflation was almost guaranteed. Producers would charge higher prices, which would make it seem like demand was increasing, encouraging businesses to invest in projects they couldn't afford, which would fail once inflation caught up. In the end, Ludwig concluded that government interference in markets would inevitably lead to economic boom and bust cycles. Now, the theory of money and credit was revolutionary. It combined macro and microeconomics in a way no other textbook had done before. But the truth is, the book didn't gain much traction at the time. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be long before Ludwig saw the devastating truth of his idea with his own eyes. Most crucially, with the Great Depression. Over a century of economic history has proved him right, but at a time when Ludwig was just starting to make an impact, the world went to war. On the 28th of July, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo. As Europe ignited into the First World War, Ludwig was sent to the front lines as a lieutenant and later a captain in the artillery. In the winter of 1914, he found himself stationed in the Carpathian Mountains, ill-prepared to face the freezing temperatures and constant bombardment from the enemy. In those moments, perhaps he reflected on the impossibility of a central office being capable of managing the resources an army needed to fight hundreds of miles away in the front lines. Despite the fact that he was opposed to the war, Ludwig led his men courageously and was decorated many times for his bravery under fire, fighting in the unforgiving terrains of the Carpathians and later on the Romanian front left him with injuries that would plague him for the rest of his life. But Ludwig wasn't just physically hurt by the war. He watched in dismay as Austro-Hungary inflated its currency in an attempt to fund the war, and, in the process, destroyed the wealth of the middle class and wiped out the value of individual savings. It was a lesson Ludwig had already learned, but many others never would. The state's ability to finance wars through debt or money printing is criminal. Or, just in general, state interference in the money supply is a dangerous gamble. In the later years of the war, Ludwig lent his brilliant mind to the war effort by working for the Ministry of War's Department of Economics. What he saw there shocked him. Army supplies were delayed, resources wasted, and the black market thrived, all because the war effort was centrally planned. This system was called war socialism, and Ludwig thought it was abhorrent. If the only consequence of this had been the destruction of wealth, that would have been bad enough. That it cost the lives of so many young men was unforgivable. Later on in his memoirs, he wrote, "Do not give in to evil, but proceed ever more boldly against it." Ludwig couldn't ignore the injustice of millions of young men being slaughtered and future generations being forced into debt, while their generals, prime ministers, and kings sat in safety many hundreds of miles away. Everywhere he looked, he saw the devastating impact of state intervention in the lives of the individual. When the war finally ended and Ludwig returned to Vienna, he was hopeful that peace would bring in a new era of prosperity and freedom. But instead, a new disaster awaited him. After World War I, Ludwig refused a high-level job at the Austrian central bank because he knew he would be required to defend policies he opposed, especially inflation and bureaucracy. At the time, the Austrian government was printing immense amounts of money to pay for its deficits, so the country experienced extreme hyperinflation. After the Great Depression, which Ludwig had practically predicted in his first book, this only got worse. So instead, he took a job as chief economic advisor to the Austrian Chamber of Commerce, where he became a lone voice defending sound monetary policy and market liberalism. At the time, the Austrian government was printing ludicrous amounts of money, but Ludwig worked with officials to make the Austrian crown backed by gold, which ultimately saved the country from hyperinflation. Also at the time, Austria was charging extremely high taxes on new properties, which disincentivized housing developers from building new houses, which in turn reduced the number of homes for ordinary men and women to live in. Ludwig fearlessly opposed this policy, and he argued instead for less regulation, and to allow the market to decide the most rational prices for rents. Unfortunately, in post-World War I Europe, he was shouting into the wind. Socialism was sweeping the European continent, and even worse, Ludwig found that no university wanted to hire him as a professor for 3 key reasons. His devotion to laissez-faire economics was deeply unfashionable. People found his uncompromising economic views abrasive, and the most dangerous thing of all in Europe in the 1920s, he was Jewish. Despite the discrimination, Ludwig simply forged his own path. Being fashionable was never important to Ludwig. What he cared about was being right. So, starting in 1922, he began leading private seminars, called Mises Circles, to expand on his ideas with other people. It was typical of a man who prized principle over ego, that he was happy to teach in small rooms over grand lecture halls. It was also around this time that he published his second book, Socialism, in which he presented one of his key insights, the economic calculation problem. Imagine a central government created their own version of Amazon. Some bureaucrat decides to sell smartphones at an arbitrary price of $200. While they might be able to calculate the cost of raw materials, how could they judge the demand for such a product? Should they use the limited supply of glass, silicon, and lithium to build phones? Or are tablets what people actually want? Ludwig argued that in a centrally planned economy, where the government makes all economic decisions, it's impossible to accurately price goods and services because no central body could ever make the right decision about thousands of producers and purchasers competing for the same resources to make thousands of different products and services. However, when millions of people collectively decide on prices based on their actual wants and needs, the market automatically finds the right price. His key point was that market prices are valuable information about what people value. Without this information, centralized systems run the risk of wasting resources on things no one wants and causing shortages of things they actually do. Ludwig understood that the only way to operate a rational market was to allow individuals to conduct economic activity between themselves, free from interference from governments, because even with the best intentions, central planners are doomed to fail. It's hard to understand how radical this idea was in 1920s Europe, but that is what made Ludwig such a great economist. His defiance in the face of dogma and unyielding commitment to the truth. However, by 1934, that resolve was about to face its greatest challenge yet, because Europe was about to face the ultimate example of the evil of state control. The Nazis rose to power in Germany in 1933, and it was only a matter of time before they would take control in Austria. The next year, there was an attempted coup by Austrian Nazis. Ultimately, it was unsuccessful, but the writing was on the wall. Vienna was no longer safe for Ludwig. So, even though it meant giving up a certain level of prestige and influence he had built up in Austria, not to mention his homeland, he sought refuge in Geneva. It was definitely the right move. In 1938, shortly after Austria became part of Nazi Germany, the Gestapo raided Ludwig's old apartment in Vienna. They took all his manuscripts, notes, and unpublished works and labeled them dangerous. Here was the ultimate irony. The man who had warned of the dangers of state control and loss of individual freedom now suffered that same fate himself, but this didn't stop him from teaching. In Geneva, Ludwig became a professor at the Graduate Institute of International Studies. He was able to develop his economic ideas on value and his critiques of socialism, and he even taught a little bit of French. He also married his wife, and while he was somewhat isolated, he was able to maintain correspondence with his peers and continue debates about everything that was important to him. However, when the Nazis invaded France in 1940, Ludwig knew it was time to finally leave Europe. He moved again, this time to the United States. But if he thought he would receive a warm welcome in the land of the brave and the free, he would be disappointed. To recover from the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had introduced the New Deal. This was a countrywide economic policy that instituted unprecedented levels of state intervention into the economy. Simply put, Ludwig's ideas were not popular in America at the time, and because of this, no higher education institute wanted to give him a job. He was only able to lecture at New York University thanks to a generous advertising executive who sponsored his salary. Despite being exiled and effectively silenced, Ludwig continued teaching and writing for anyone who would listen. Ultimately, this culminated in the publication of his magnum opus, Human Action, in 1949. This was Ludwig's most complete and wide-ranging work, combining all his key ideas on economic theory, money, business cycles, and the powerful new idea of praxeology. In simple terms, praxeology says that economic activity is the result of human action, which is unpredictable and cannot be studied in a purely scientific way. This might seem obvious, but the economists of the day were more interested in studying economics by making hypotheses and forming theories based on statistical models. So, for example, imagine you own a small bakery, and you've hired 2 part-time workers at $10 an hour. One day, the government passes a law raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. When you do the math, you realize you can't afford to keep both employees without raising prices, which will drive away customers, or cutting costs, which reduces the quality of your product and service. So, maybe you reduce one of your employees' hours or let them go entirely. A traditional economist might look at this situation and say, let's gather data from shops across the country and see if raising the minimum wage actually increases unemployment. A praxeologist would say you don't need a study to find this out, you just need logic. Here's how it would go. Praxeology starts from a simple idea that humans act purposefully to achieve goals. Your goal as the owner of a bakery in a competitive environment is to provide the best products and services at the lowest possible price. And from that assumption, you can use logical deduction to understand your economic decisions. A minimum wage is a rule saying you can't pay below a certain amount. If the law forces employers to pay more compared to the value a worker produces, they'll be less likely to hire. That's not just a statistic, it's a logical consequence that follows from how humans reason and act. So, by imposing a price floor on the market rate, by logical necessity, there will be a disincentive to employ people. It's not that data and experiments and statistics are useless, but they're insufficient on their own. Mises believed that logical reasoning was more reliable because in the real world, you can never isolate just one variable. And at the end of the day, economics is about people, not machines. Human Action remains Ludwig's greatest work and a foundational text for any student of the Austrian School of Economics. For the next 20 years, Ludwig continued lecturing at New York University. Starting in 1950, he conducted a series of legendary seminars on libertarianism, which pretty much single-handedly kept the movement alive. He He was never paid by the university itself, but those seminars became a hub for a new generation of scholars who guaranteed his work would endure after his death. In 1962, Austria officially acknowledged Ludwig's contributions by awarding him the Austrian Decoration for Science and Art. It was a small ceremony at the Austrian embassy in Washington, D.C., but most of his recognitions came after his death. Despite never gaining mainstream acceptance in his lifetime, Ludwig's ideas laid down the foundations upon which much of modern libertarianism and free market thinking is built. Less than a year after his death, on October 10, 1973, his colleague and friend, Friedrich Hayek, was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics. Hayek's intellectual debt to Ludwig has never been in doubt. In 1982, nearly a decade after his death, Ludwig's former students founded the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, which was and still is dedicated to promoting his ideas of free markets and individual liberty. Ludwig's legacy lives on through the work of Mises Institute and libertarian think tanks and institutions worldwide. Even Bitcoiners got some of their ideas from Ludwig. The first paragraph of the Bitcoin white paper literally talks about how in our current economic system, we have to trust banks not to devalue currencies by printing excess money, which leads to economic boom and bust cycles. In a century darkened by totalitarianism and tyranny, Ludwig von Mises was a burning torch for reason and liberty. Today, that light is spread, not just by institutions and universities, but by every person who chooses to think independently and act freely, even when they're pressured not to. Especially when they're pressured not to. At Ratio Freedom, we explore the idea of freedom in all its forms. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love our episode on Marco Pierre White, the celebrity chef who became a philosopher. It's a great story, and you can watch it by clicking the video on screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.